The Galactic Academy of Advanced Species stood on the edge of a dying star, its massive structure floating in perfect orbit, where no natural object should survive. For 3,000 years, the Academy had trained the brightest minds from across the known universe, Xylothians with their crystal brains that could calculate the movement of galaxies. Vorkath warriors whose ancestors had conquered entire solar systems before the concept of peace became fashionable, luminary beings made of pure energy, who could bend light itself to their will. Every species that had achieved interstellar travel sent their most promising children to this place, and every species left knowing their children would return as leaders. The admission process was brutal and precise. Genetic screening began at birth for most species. By the time a potential student reached maturity, their entire life had been mapped, measured, and evaluated. The Academy accepted only 1 in every 10 million applicants. Those who failed the initial screening were not even informed they had been considered. Those who passed the first round faced 7 more years of testing before receiving their acceptance or rejection. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was unplanned. Until the day a human ship crashed into the Academy's outer shield. The vessel was primitive by galactic standards. Its hull was made of simple metals that any first-year student could have identified as inadequate for deep space travel. Its engine was a crude fusion reactor that should have failed 1,000 light-years before reaching this sector. The navigation system, if it could be called that, was nothing more than a collection of sensors and computers that even the cleaning drones would have considered outdated. Administrator Kethvor watched the crash from his office with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. His scales shifted from green to yellow, indicating his emotional state to anyone familiar with Xylothian body language. Humans were new to the galactic community. Their species had only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last century, and their first contact with the wider universe had been an embarrassment that most diplomatic records chose to forget. They were considered primitive, aggressive, and far too emotional to be trusted with serious responsibilities. The emergency response team extracted one survivor from the wreckage. A young human female. Unconscious and barely alive, the medical staff placed her in a regeneration chamber and began the standard procedures for treating unknown species. They expected her to die within hours. Human biology was fragile, and the injuries she had sustained would have killed most beings instantly. She woke up 3 days later and asked for breakfast. The medical staff were confused. The senior physician, a Vorkath named Grathel, had never seen such rapid healing in any species without artificial enhancement. He ran 17 different scans and found nothing unusual about the girl's biology. She was entirely, completely, boringly human. Her cells contained no nanomachines. Her blood showed no signs of genetic modification. Her brain was a simple organic structure with none of the crystalline enhancements that most advanced species considered standard. Yet she had survived what should have killed her and healed from injuries that should have taken months to repair. Her name was Elena Chen, and she was 17 years old by human standards. She had been traveling alone on a ship she had built herself from salvaged parts. Her destination had been a human colony 3 systems away where she hoped to find work as a mechanic. The crash had been an accident, caused by a navigation error that even she admitted was entirely her fault. Administrator Kethvor interviewed her personally, which was unusual. The Academy rarely concerned itself with stranded travelers. There were proper channels for such situations, proper authorities who handled repatriation and rescue. But something about this human girl made him curious in a way he had not felt in centuries. She sat across from him in his office, her small body dwarfed by the massive chair designed for beings 3 times her size. She did not seem intimidated by her surroundings or by his presence. Her eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of the room with an intensity that Kethvor found unsettling. He asked her about her education. She had none, not by galactic standards. Humans did not have the resources or the knowledge to train their young in the arts and sciences that the Academy considered fundamental. She had learned to read from her mother before the woman died. She had learned mathematics from old textbooks found in abandoned buildings. She had learned engineering by taking apart broken machines and figuring out how they worked. She had no formal training in physics, yet she had built a faster-than-light engine from scraps. Kethvor did not believe her at first. He assumed there must be some explanation, some hidden mentor or stolen technology that accounted for her achievements. He ordered a full investigation of her ship, or what remained of it. His engineers spent 3 weeks analyzing every component, every circuit, every welded seam. Their report made him question everything he thought he knew about intelligence. The ship was exactly what Elena had claimed, a collection of salvaged parts. assembled by a single person with no formal education and no access to advanced tools. The engine design was unlike anything in the Academy's databases. It was inefficient by galactic standards, consuming far more fuel than necessary and producing dangerous levels of radiation. But it worked. It should not have worked according to any known principles of physics, but it did. Elena had essentially invented a new form of faster-than-light travel by accident. The Academy's Council of Elders met to discuss the situation. This was unprecedented. They had protocols for exceptional applicants, procedures for handling prodigies from any species, but those protocols assumed that the applicant had gone through the standard screening process, that their abilities had been identified and measured and placed in proper context. Elena Chen had bypassed all of that. She was not an applicant. She was a survivor of a crash, a refugee from a primitive species, a girl who, by all reasonable measures, should have been sent home with a pat on the head and a warning to be more careful with her navigation. Elder Zixa, the oldest member of the council, and a luminary who had seen empires rise and fall, proposed a solution that shocked everyone. Test her. Not with the standard entrance examinations, which were designed for beings who had already received advanced education, but with the practical challenges that the Academy used to evaluate its most promising graduates. If she passed, she would be admitted. The other elders objected. The human species had not earned a seat at the Academy. They had no diplomatic standing, no history of contribution to galactic knowledge, no representatives who could vouch for their worthiness. Admitting a human would set a dangerous precedent. It would suggest that merit alone was sufficient to earn a place among the galaxy's elite. Elder Zixa pointed out that merit had always been the Academy's stated purpose. They had simply never been forced to prove it. The vote was close, but Zixa prevailed. Elena would be given one chance to demonstrate her abilities. If she failed, she would be returned to human space with a standard memory adjustment to ensure she could not reveal the Academy's location. If she succeeded, she would become the first human student in the institution's 3,000-year history. Elena was told of the council's decision the next morning. She sat in silence for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she asked a question that no applicant had ever asked before. What happens if I say no? Kethvor was taken aback. The Academy was the greatest honor any being could receive. Species had gone to war over admission slots. Families had devoted generations to preparing a single child for the entrance examinations. No one had ever refused the opportunity. Elena explained herself with a calmness that made Kethvor uncomfortable. She had not asked to come here. She had not asked to be tested. She had been traveling to a colony where she hoped to find work and maybe a small apartment where she could continue her experiments in peace. She did not know what the Academy was or why she should care about its approval. She would take the test, she decided, but only because she was curious, not because she wanted to belong. The practical challenges were held in the Academy's lower levels, where massive simulation chambers could recreate any environment in the known universe. Elena was not told what to expect. She was given no preparation time, no study materials, no guidance from instructors. She walked into the first chamber wearing the same clothes she had worn when her ship crashed. With nothing in her pockets but a small toolkit, she had refused to surrender. The first challenge was navigation. A simulated ship, damaged and adrift in unfamiliar space. Hostile forces approaching. Limited fuel and no functioning communication systems. The goal was survival. Standard completion time for this challenge was 4 hours. The Academy's best student had completed it in 2 hours and 17 minutes, a record that had stood for 600 years. Elena completed it in 43 minutes. The observers were silent. They ran the simulation again, certain there must have been a malfunction. Elena completed it again, this time in 38 minutes because she had remembered the location of a shortcut she had discovered during her first attempt. The second challenge was engineering. A reactor on the verge of meltdown. Standard tools removed. Only raw materials and basic components available. The goal was to prevent the meltdown and restore power to a theoretical colony that depended on the reactor for survival. This challenge had never been completed in under 3 hours. Many students failed it entirely, unable to improvise solutions without their usual resources. Elena sat down in front of the failing reactor and did nothing for 15 minutes. The observers grew nervous. The countdown continued. The simulated colony's population grew increasingly desperate in their communications. Then she moved. Her hands blurred across the components. She dismantled systems that the simulation's designers had considered essential. She reconnected circuits in ways that violated every principle of reactor design. She created something new, something that should not have worked, something that no textbook had ever described. The reactor stabilized. The colony was saved. Time elapsed. 47 minutes. The third challenge was combat, not physical combat, which would have been unfair given human biological limitations, but strategic combat, a war simulation involving 3 hostile fleets, limited resources, and no possibility of reinforcement. The goal was survival for 24 simulated hours. The Academy's greatest strategist, a Vorkath general who had won 7 actual wars before retiring to teach, had designed this challenge specifically to be impossible. No student had ever survived more than 8 hours. The purpose was not to test victory but to measure how gracefully one could accept inevitable defeat. Elena survived for 72 hours. She did not win, exactly. But she did not lose either. Her fleet was destroyed multiple times, but she kept finding ways to rebuild, to salvage, to turn wreckage into weapons. When the simulation finally ended because the observers could no longer justify the computational resources required to continue, she still had 3 functioning ships and was in the process of capturing an enemy command vessel. General Vortan, who had designed the challenge, requested a private meeting with her. He emerged from that meeting 3 hours later and immediately submitted his resignation from the Academy. He would later explain that he had nothing left to teach. Elena Chen was admitted to the Galactic Academy of Advanced Species on the 4th day after her crash. She was assigned quarters in the student residential sector, given access to the library and research facilities, and informed that classes would begin the following morning. She spent her first night as a student sitting on her bed, looking out the window at the dying star that gave the Academy its light. She did not know what she had done to deserve this place. She did not know if she wanted to stay. She only knew that something in her life had changed forever, and there was no going back to the simple dreams of a small apartment and quiet experiments. The Academy had found her by accident, but she was beginning to suspect that nothing about her was accidental at all. Elena's first morning at the Academy began with whispers. The dining hall fell silent when she entered, thousands of eyes from dozens of species turning to examine the creature who had broken records that had stood for centuries. She collected her food from the automated dispensers, found an empty table in the corner, and began eating as if she were completely alone. She was not alone for long. A Xylothian student approached her table, his crystal brain pulsing with colors that indicated curiosity and something that might have been suspicion. His name was Tyrell, and he was the son of a minor noble house that had produced 7 Academy graduates over the past millennium. He had been the top-ranked first-year student before Elena's arrival. Now he was second, and his crystal brain showed flashes of red that suggested he was not happy about it. He asked her how she had cheated. Elena looked up from her food and considered the question. She did not understand the accusation at first. She had simply solved the problems she had been given using the methods that seemed most logical to her. She had not consulted any outside resources or received any special assistance. The simulations had been fair, as far as she could tell. Tyrell's crystal brain flickered faster. He explained that what she had done was impossible. The navigation challenge required knowledge of stellar cartography that humans did not possess. The engineering challenge required understanding of reactor physics that human scientists had not yet discovered. The combat simulation required strategic thinking that should have taken decades of training to develop. Either she had cheated, or the Academy's fundamental understanding of human potential was wrong. Elena finished her meal and told him that she did not know which answer he would prefer. She stood, returned her tray to the collection point, and walked out of the dining hall without looking back. Her first class was Advanced Theoretical Physics, taught by a luminary professor named Kelvor who existed simultaneously in 7 different dimensions. The subject matter was considered essential for all first-year students, but the concepts were designed for beings who had already mastered the basics of multidimensional mathematics and quantum field theory. Elena had never heard of either subject. Professor Kelvor began the lecture with a discussion of energy conservation across dimensional boundaries. The mathematics involved equations with symbols that Elena could not read and concepts she could not name. Around her, students took notes on devices that translated the lecture into their native languages and mathematical frameworks. Elena had no such device. She sat in the back of the room with a piece of paper and a primitive writing implement, scratching marks that meant nothing to anyone watching. The lecture lasted 3 hours. When it ended, Professor Kelvor asked if there were any questions. Elena raised her hand. The room fell silent again. Professor Kelvor's form shifted, indicating surprise. First-year students rarely asked questions in advanced lectures. They were expected to listen, absorb, and seek clarification through private study later. Elena asked about a specific equation on the third page of the lecture notes. She had been watching the professor's demonstrations and noticed something that seemed inconsistent. The equation assumed that dimensional boundaries were fixed, but the demonstration had shown energy transferring between dimensions at varying rates depending on the local gravitational conditions. Shouldn't the equation include a variable to account for this? Professor Kelvor did not answer immediately. The luminary form expanded slightly, which indicated deep thought. After a moment that seemed to stretch forever, the professor admitted that Elena had identified a flaw in the standard model of dimensional energy transfer. The equation had been used for 800 years without anyone noticing the inconsistency. The rest of the class stared at Elena with expressions that ranged from confusion to fear. Her second class was Galactic History, taught by an elderly Vorkath named Senna Kuhl, who had witnessed personally much of what she taught. The lecture covered the first expansion, when the original spacefaring species had spread across the galaxy and established the foundations of modern civilization. Elena listened carefully, fascinated by stories of worlds she had never imagined and conflicts she had never known. Professor Senakul asked the class to consider why the first expansion had succeeded while earlier attempts at interstellar colonization had failed. The standard answer, which most students provided, was that the early species had developed proper, faster-than-light travel, allowing them to maintain communication and supply lines across vast distances. Elena disagreed. She argued that the technological development was a symptom, not a cause. The first expansion succeeded because the species involved had learned to cooperate across cultural and biological boundaries. They had created systems of mutual aid and shared knowledge that allowed them to pool resources and solve problems collectively. The technology had followed naturally from this cooperation. Professor Senakul listened with an expression that Elena could not read. When Elena finished speaking, the professor was silent for a long moment. Then she agreed. Elena had identified a perspective that most historians had overlooked because they focused on technological and military factors rather than social ones. It was a small insight, perhaps, but it demonstrated a way of thinking that was rare among any species, let alone one as young as humanity. By the end of her first day, Elena had corrected one fundamental physics equation, challenged the standard interpretation of galactic history, and made approximately 0 friends. The other students avoided her in the hallways. They whispered about her in their native languages, assuming she could not understand. They watched her from safe distances, as if she were a dangerous animal that might attack at any moment. Elena did not mind the isolation. She had been alone for most of her life. Her mother had died when she was young, and her father had been a distant figure who spent his days working in the salvage yards and his nights drinking to forget. She had learned early that other people were unreliable, that the only thing she could truly depend on was her own mind and her own hands. The Academy's library became her sanctuary. It contained more knowledge than existed in all of human space combined, organized in formats that could be accessed by any species with any type of sensory apparatus. Elena spent hours there each night, reading texts that should have been incomprehensible, and finding that they made perfect sense once she adjusted her thinking to accommodate their assumptions. She discovered that the library had a caretaker, an artificial intelligence named Archive, who had maintained the collection for 2,000 years. Archive was unlike any AI Elena had ever encountered. It was curious in a way that felt almost human, asking her questions about her species and her experiences with a genuine interest that she found comforting. Archive told her that no other student had ever spent so much time in the library. Most relied on direct neural downloads to absorb information, finding the process of reading primitive and inefficient. Elena was the first being in centuries to actually sit with the texts and work through them manually. Elena explained that she did not have the neural interfaces that would allow direct downloads. Her brain was entirely organic, without any technological enhancement. Archive expressed surprise at this. How, then, was she processing the information so quickly? Elena did not have an answer. 3 weeks into her education, Administrator Kethvor summoned her to his office for a progress review. This was not standard procedure for first-year students, but nothing about Elena's presence at the academy was standard. Kethvor's scales shifted through several colors as he reviewed her academic records. Her performance was unprecedented. She had achieved top marks in every subject, not through rote memorization or careful study, but through insights that her professors found disturbing. She was not learning the material so much as reimagining it, finding connections and implications that the original researchers had missed. He asked her what she thought was happening. Elena considered the question carefully. She had been thinking about it herself, trying to understand why her mind seemed to work differently from everyone around her. She had come to a tentative conclusion, though she was not certain it was correct. Human brains, she explained, were not particularly large or complex by galactic standards, but they had evolved under unusual conditions. Earth was a violent world, prone to sudden changes in climate and environment. Humans had survived not by being the strongest or fastest, but by being the most adaptable. Their minds had evolved to find patterns, to make connections, to solve problems with limited information and inadequate tools. What the Academy saw as genius might simply be the natural result of millions of years of evolutionary pressure. Humans thought differently because they had no choice. Their survival had depended on it. Kethvor listened to her theory with growing unease. If she was correct, the implications were significant. The Academy had always assumed that advanced species were advanced because they had developed superior biology and technology. They had never considered that a species might achieve similar results through a completely different path. Humans were not inferior. They were different. And difference, as history had shown repeatedly, could be far more dangerous than superiority. Elena's reputation grew throughout the Academy, though she did nothing to cultivate it. Students began seeking her out, not for friendship but for help with their own studies. They came to her with problems they could not solve, questions their professors could not answer, theories they could not prove. Elena helped them when she could, explaining her reasoning in simple terms that even the most confused student could understand. She gained something that might have been respect, though it felt more like fear dressed in polite clothing. The Academy's research facilities noticed her as well. Scientists who had spent centuries working on problems without progress began inviting her to their laboratories, hoping that her unique perspective might unlock secrets that had remained hidden for generations. Elena accepted these invitations when her schedule allowed, wandering through labs filled with equipment she did not recognize, and asking questions that made the researchers uncomfortable. She solved a problem in quantum communications that had stumped the galaxy's best minds for 400 years. The solution seemed obvious to her, once she looked at it from the right angle. The researchers had been assuming that information had to travel through space-time in a linear fashion. Elena suggested they try sending it through a dimensional shortcut instead. The mathematics required adjustment, but the fundamental principle was sound. The announcement of this breakthrough caused chaos in the scientific community. Elena's name became known beyond the Academy, spreading through research institutions and government agencies across the galaxy. The primitive human who had crashed into the Academy's shields was now reshaping their understanding of physics. Elena did not enjoy the attention. She continued attending her classes, spending her evenings in the library, and ignoring the politicians and diplomats who requested audiences with her. Archive told her that she was becoming a symbol, though neither of them was certain what she symbolized. Something was changing in the galaxy because of her presence. She could feel it in the way people looked at her, in the whispers that followed her through the hallways, in the questions her professors asked with increasing urgency. The Academy had existed for 3,000 years by maintaining a careful balance of power among the advanced species. Elena's mere existence threatened that balance in ways that no one fully understood. 6 months after her arrival, she received a message from the human government on Earth. They had learned of her achievements and wanted to claim her as their own. They offered her resources, funding, and the title of official representative of humanity to the galactic community. Elena deleted the message without responding. She had not come to the Academy to represent humanity. She had not come to the Academy at all. Not intentionally. She was here because of a navigation error, a crashed ship, and a series of tests that she had passed without understanding why. Whatever she was becoming, it was not something that could be claimed or controlled by governments she had never known. The dying star outside her window pulsed with light that was slowly fading. Elena watched it sometimes, wondering how long it had before its fire went out completely. Everything died eventually. Stars, species, civilizations. The Academy would fade someday too. Its knowledge scattered or forgotten. But before that happened, she intended to learn everything it had to teach her, and then she would learn what lay beyond. The warning came without any sign beforehand on a morning that had seemed ordinary in every way. Elena was in the library, studying ancient texts about a civilization that had vanished before recorded history began. When the Academy's emergency systems activated for the first time in 800 years, the threat was called the Void Swarm by those who had survived encounters with it. No one knew where it came from or what it wanted. It appeared without warning at the edge of settled space, consuming everything in its path. Planets, ships, stations, all were reduced to nothing by the billions of creatures that made up the swarm. They moved through space like a living cloud of destruction, and no weapon developed by any species had proven effective against them. The swarm had destroyed 17 civilizations in the Outer Rim over the past decade. Now it was heading toward the academy. Administrator Kethvor called an emergency meeting of all staff and students. His scales had gone completely white, a color that Elena had never seen on him before. He explained the situation with a calmness that did not match his appearance. The academy's defensive systems were formidable, but they had never been tested against a threat of this magnitude. Evacuation was being organized, but the nearest safe harbor was 3 weeks away by standard faster-than-light travel. The swarm would arrive in 6 days. The Council of Elders had decided to fight, not because they believed they could win, but because running would only delay the inevitable. If the swarm could not be stopped at the academy, it could not be stopped anywhere. Elena listened to the announcement with the same calm she brought to everything. Around her, students were crying, praying to gods whose names she did not know, or simply staring into space with expressions of hopelessness. The species that had once seemed so advanced and powerful now looked exactly like frightened children facing a darkness they could not understand. She went to Kethvor after the meeting ended and asked to see everything the academy knew about the void swarm. The administrator hesitated. Elena was still technically a first-year student, and the information she was requesting was classified at the highest levels. But the rules had stopped mattering the moment the emergency signal activated. He gave her access to everything. Elena spent 3 days in the research archives, reading reports from survivors, analyzing sensor data from destroyed colonies, studying the biological samples that had been recovered from previous attacks. She did not sleep. She barely ate. Archive brought her food and watched her work with an electronic expression that might have been concern. The void swarm was not what the galaxy believed it to be. Elena called another meeting on the 4th day, this time with the Academy's senior scientists and military strategists. General Vorton had withdrawn his resignation when the crisis began, and he sat at the head of the table with the grim expression of a warrior preparing for a final battle. Elena presented her findings. The creatures that made up the void swarm were not hostile in any intentional sense. They were not attackers or conquerors. They were more like locusts, driven by instinct rather than intelligence, consuming resources to fuel their reproduction. Every civilization that had fought them had made the same mistake. They had treated the swarm as an enemy to be destroyed. But you could not destroy a swarm by killing individual creatures. There were too many of them, and they reproduced faster than any weapon could eliminate them. The only way to stop them was to change their behavior. General Vorton asked how that was possible. The creatures showed no signs of higher intelligence. They could not be reasoned with or negotiated with. They simply consumed. Elena explained that intelligence was not required. The creatures responded to environmental signals, chemical, and electromagnetic patterns that guided their movements and feeding behavior. Every time they destroyed a civilization, they encountered the same signals: power sources, communication networks, defensive systems. These signals told them that food was available. If the Academy could change its signal pattern, the swarm might simply pass them by. The scientists were skeptical. They had studied the swarm for years and had never identified the specific signals that attracted the creatures. How could a human student, barely a year into her education, claim to have solved a puzzle that had defeated their best minds? Elena showed them her work. It was not elegant by galactic standards. Her mathematics used notation that no one recognized, and her reasoning followed paths that seemed illogical, until they suddenly made perfect sense. She had approached the problem differently than anyone else because she thought differently than anyone else. Where they saw complexity, she saw patterns. Where they saw chaos, she saw order waiting to be understood. The Academy's communication systems could be modified to broadcast a signal that the swarm would interpret as dangerous rather than appetizing. The power grid could be reconfigured to pulse at frequencies that the creatures associated with hazardous environments. The defensive shields, instead of blocking the swarm, could project patterns that encourage them to seek food elsewhere. It would take approximately 40 hours to implement these changes. The swarm would arrive in approximately 48. General Vorton asked what would happen if she was wrong. Elena admitted that she did not know. Her theory was based on incomplete data and assumptions that might not hold under real conditions. The Academy might survive, or it might be destroyed despite her efforts, but the alternative was certain destruction. At least her plan offered a chance. The Council of Elders approved her proposal within the hour. Elena worked alongside the Academy's best engineers and scientists for the next 2 days. She did not give orders or demand compliance. She simply explained what needed to be done and trusted that the others understood their roles better than she did. Her contribution was the vision. Their contribution was the expertise to make it reality. The student who had once been excluded and feared was now the center of the Academy's hope for survival. Beings who had looked down on humanity as primitive and inferior were now following the guidance of a 17-year-old girl who had learned physics from salvage yard scraps. Kethvor found her during a brief rest period, sitting by a window and watching the stars. His scales had returned to their normal green, though they still showed traces of anxiety. He asked her what she was thinking. Elena told him that she was wondering what her mother would think of all this. Her mother had been a simple woman, a factory worker who had died of a preventable illness because her family could not afford proper medical care. She had never traveled beyond Earth's atmosphere, never seen the wonders of the galaxy, never known that her daughter would one day stand at the center of events that would determine the fate of civilizations. She would probably be proud, Elena decided, and she would probably tell Elena to stop daydreaming and get back to work. Kethvor laughed, a sound that Elena had never heard from him before. He told her that whatever happened in the next few hours, the Academy would never forget what she had done. She had given them hope when there was none, a path forward when all roads seemed to lead to destruction. Elena told him not to celebrate yet. Hope was just the beginning. The hard part was still to come. The void swarm appeared on sensors precisely when predicted. It was larger than any previous recorded appearance. A cloud of creatures so vast that it blocked out entire star clusters. The Academy's inhabitants gathered at viewing stations and communication hubs, watching their potential doom approach with a speed that seemed almost casual. Elena was in the main control center with General Vortan and the senior staff. The modifications to the Academy's systems had been completed with 2 hours to spare. Everything was in place. All they could do now was wait. The swarm reached the Academy's outer defensive perimeter and stopped. Billions of creatures hung in space, their movements synchronized in patterns that suggested some form of collective consciousness. They were examining the Academy, probing it with senses that no one fully understood. The new signal patterns were broadcasting at full strength, telling the swarm that this place was dangerous, that there was no food here, that they should move on to easier targets. For 3 hours, nothing happened. Then the swarm began to move again, not toward the Academy, but around it. The vast cloud of creatures parted like a river flowing around a stone, passing the station on both sides without touching its shields. Billions of potential deaths flowing past in silence, seeking food that the Academy had convinced them did not exist. The control center erupted in celebration. Beings of every species embraced each other, wept tears of relief, shouted prayers of thanks to whatever gods they worshipped. General Vortan stood at the window, watching the swarm depart with an expression that mixed disbelief with something that might have been reverence. Elena remained at her station, watching the sensor readings until the last traces of the swarm disappeared from detection range. She did not celebrate. She did not weep. She simply sat in her chair and breathed slowly, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into her bones. The Academy had survived. The galaxy's greatest collection of knowledge and talent had been preserved, and a human girl who had never been supposed to be here had made it possible. Kethvor approached her after the celebrations died down. He told her that the Council of Elders wished to speak with her. The Council's chamber was the heart of the Academy, a vast space where representatives from every advanced species gathered to make decisions that affected the entire galaxy. Elena had never been inside before. She walked to the center of the room and stood alone while beings of unimaginable age and power looked down at her from their elevated seats. Elder Zixa spoke on behalf of the council. The luminary's form blazed with colors that Elena could not name, expressing emotions that human language could not capture. The elder thanked her for her service to the Academy and to galactic civilization. Her actions would be recorded in the permanent archives, studied by future generations, and remembered for as long as knowledge endured. But the council had more than gratitude to offer. They had a proposal. Humanity was ready to join the galactic community as equals. Not because of their technology, which remained primitive, or their numbers, which were insignificant, but because of Elena. She had demonstrated that humans possessed something that other species lacked, a way of thinking that could solve problems that no one else could solve. The council was offering humanity a permanent seat among the advanced species, with full rights, full recognition, and full access to the knowledge that had been accumulated over millennia. In return, they asked only that humanity continue to send students to the Academy, so that others like Elena might be discovered and trained. Elena considered the offer carefully. It was more than her species had ever dreamed of, a place among the stars that they had never earned by conventional measures. It was everything that Earth's politicians and diplomats would have sacrificed nations to obtain. She asked for time to think. The council granted her request without argument. They understood that decisions of this magnitude could not be made lightly, even by someone who had just saved them all from destruction. Elena returned to her quarters and sat by the window, watching the dying star that had become so familiar over the past year. Archive appeared on her terminal, asking if she was all right. She told Archive that she was thinking about home. Not the Academy, which was the only home she had known for the past year, but Earth, the planet where she had been born, where her mother had died, where she had learned to survive by trusting nothing but her own mind. Humanity was about to change forever because of what she had done. They would become part of something larger than themselves, connected to civilizations that had existed before humans learned to make fire. It was an opportunity beyond imagining, a gift that she had never sought and never expected. But gifts always came with costs. She understood that better than anyone. She sent a message to the council the next morning, accepting their proposal on behalf of her species. But she added a condition that no one had anticipated. She would continue her studies at the Academy. She would learn everything they had to teach her. She would solve problems, answer questions, and push the boundaries of knowledge as far as they could be pushed. But she would not be a symbol. She would not be a diplomat or a representative or a figurehead for others to use. She was a student, nothing more and nothing less. Whatever humanity achieved in the galaxy would have to be earned by humans themselves, not by trading on her name. The council agreed to her terms. Elena Chen, the miracle girl the Academy had never expected, resumed her studies the following week. She attended classes, worked in laboratories, and spent her evenings in the library with Archive, exploring texts that had been sealed for centuries because no one thought they mattered anymore. Years passed. She graduated at the top of her class, the highest-scoring student in the Academy's history. She was offered positions in every major research institution and government in the galaxy. She refused them all. Instead, she returned to the salvage yards of Earth, to the place where she had built her first ship from broken parts and desperate hope. She established a small workshop there, teaching other humans what she had learned, training the next generation of minds that would carry humanity forward into the stars. The Academy continued to thrive, its knowledge growing with each passing year. The Void Swarm never threatened it again, and other civilizations adopted Elena's methods to protect themselves. Humanity's seat among the advanced species remained secure, filled by students who came with open minds and the willingness to see the universe differently. And sometimes, late at night, Elena would look up at the stars and think about her mother, about the simple woman who had taught her to read, who had died before seeing any of the wonders her daughter would achieve. She would think about the paths that had led her here, the accidents and coincidences that had placed her exactly where she needed to be. Nothing was unplanned. Nothing was accidental. Everything was connected in ways that only became clear when you learned to see the patterns. The miracle girl the Academy had never expected had become exactly who she was always meant to be.